Well, so my first breakaway on a Tuesday night, my first Tuesday night as the executive director of Breakaway was on August 30th, 2016. And what I want to do is I just want to give you a behind the scenes look at what the 24 hours leading up to my first Tuesday night as the executive director looked like, okay? Just a few days before, actually, the 24 hours leading up to my first breakaway, I was with my staff, and my staff asked me if I wanted to have bomb dogs at Breakaway. And when they said that, honestly, the thought that popped into my mind was, I was like, what are bomb dogs? Is that like a food truck and like their like specialty item is called bomb dogs? And they're like, no. They're dogs that actually sniff bombs. Do you want those at Breakaway? And I was like, okay, I just stepped into a position that's on a level where things have to be thought about that I've just not thought about before. And so that was a few days before. And then we got to within 24 hours of the first breakaway, and our crew was setting up Reed Arena on the Monday before the Tuesday. And so I went up there, and they were setting up the stage, and they were putting it in the middle of the arena. They were setting it up in the round, and the plan, the expectation, we were expecting about 10,000 students to show up. And so when I saw that massive stage being set up, I'm being honest, the thought that went into my mind was, oh my gosh, they are setting up that stage for me to speak on it to 10,000 people. And some of y'all are like, that sounds amazing. I want to speak to 10,000 people. Let me just tell you, the only cool thing about speaking to 10,000 people is you get to say, I spoke to 10,000 people. Otherwise, it is terrifying, completely terrifying. And so that was on the Monday before, and then on Tuesday morning of August 30th, I woke up and the battalion put me on their front page. And I remember being so insecure because the person that came and took the picture of me, I was standing on the stage, they were standing on the ground, so they shot me up, and I was wearing a shirt that was kind of salmon, kind of rose, maybe a little pink, and I just didn't feel good about it. But I was in the moment, and I just kind of smiled, and it hit me in all the wrong ways. And Tuesday morning, there's TA, meet the new director. I was like, that's not how I want them to remember me, but that's me on the cover of the battalion. And then I made my way to Reed Arena on that evening. And as I got to the arena, I'm talking to my friend Jeff Johnson on the phone, who used to lead worship at Breakaway. And he's kind of into fashion. And so he asked me what I was planning to wear at my first ever Breakaway as the executive director. And I told him, and he told me to go home and change. But I was already at the arena. I was already locked in, and I went with it, and I still regret it. It's hard for me to look at pictures of that night. So that was that. And then 5 minutes before Breakaway started, I walked out of the green room, and I went to my seat, like my reserved or assigned seat. And I had been seated, like my seat was assigned next to the entire band. Well, the entire band was on the stage. So I went and sat in a completely empty row. And I just sat there and I was like, I am so lonely right now. It's like there's thousands of people in this arena, and then there's just TA, like by himself on a row of 15, and I just will never forget, like just feeling so tiny in that moment, holding my little iPad. And this college student came up and just put a hand on my shoulder and was like, can I pray for you? And I was like, you pitying me right now. And yes, you can pray for me. And so that was that. And then I got up to give announcements for the first time ever as the director of Breakaway. And it was such a blur that when I got off of the stage, I went up to Kylan Perry, who was my host for the night. I was like, did I say howdy, welcome to Breakaway, or did I say howdy, welcome to Vertical? Because the ministry I'd led before Breakaway was called Vertical. And when I'd been practicing my announcements, I kept saying, howdy, welcome to Vertical. And I was like, oh, no, it's Breakaway. And Kylan was like, I don't know what you said. And I was like, oh my gosh, I said Vertical. I don't know. What did I say? And then I spent the rest of worship pacing back and forth around the basketball arena trying to find my people. I'm like, I know my wife is here somewhere. I think some friends came tonight. I wouldn't mind sitting with some people just to have kind of some people who have my back instead of going to that very, very lonely and isolating row. And then I got up to preach, and then I went home. And that was kind of my first night as executive director. I don't know if you just assume that's how my first night went at Breakaway, but now you know that was the inside scoop. And the reason that I tell you that is here's the reality. When I stepped into the position that I am in now as the director of Breakaway, my responsibility and my leadership grew overnight. Like my circumstances and my responsibilities grew overnight. And as I went through that first night as the director of Breakaway on Tuesday night, man, I felt so overwhelmed. And the question that haunted me the entire evening was this: do I have what it takes? I mean, that was the haunting question. It wasn't just that night. I mean, every Tuesday night that first year, I felt like I was stepping into an episode of The Voice where I was like, man, I'm auditioning right now for people's approval, which was so unhealthy. But the question that just rattled around in my mind and haunted me was this question: do I have what it takes? And the reason that I even tell you that is because last week, if you were with us, I told you that we're journeying through the life of David for the next several weeks, and we're in this series that we're calling Becoming a Leader Worth Following. And what we established last week is as I surveyed many of you at the first Breakaway, what I found out from you guys is that the majority of people here consider themselves a leader. And even if you're not in a formal leadership position right now, you might be informally influencing or leading your friends, and you definitely have the ambition and the intention of leading in a formal capacity before you exit your time at A&M. And even if you don't land in a formal leadership position while at A&M, if you have any intention of being someone else's boss someday or getting promoted to the point where you supervise other people, or you plan to get married, or you plan to have kids, there is going to be an opportunity to provide leadership to other people. And I just need you to know that if you spend any amount of time in leadership, you're going to find yourself in moments where there are circumstances that are just bigger than you are. That's just reality. You're going to land in circumstances and you're going to have responsibilities that are just absolutely bigger than you are. And the question that is going to rattle around in your mind is this: do I have what it takes? And if you never have to wrestle with that question, let me just tell you, you're settling. You're playing it safe. You're not leaning into a God-sized vision for your life, because I promise you, God will stretch you and He's going to put you in places where you are going to need Him in order to succeed. But when you find yourself in moments where you're asking that question, do I have what it takes? In that moment, as a leader, you're going to have a choice. And I need you to hear what this choice is, because this choice is going to drive the rest of the evening and our time together. Here's the choice that you're going to have to make. You are either going to put your trust in what you have, or you're going to put your trust in who has you. That's it. And so if you were just tuned out, I need you to tune in, because do not miss what I'm telling you right now. When you find yourself in circumstances, having responsibilities that are just bigger than you are, and that haunting question comes rolling around, do you have what it takes? You're going to have to decide, will you put your trust in what you have or in who has you? How you respond to that question will determine whether your life and leadership are marked by either fear, faith, or what's my last one? How am I blanking on this right now? Just give me a moment, people. This is so awkward. I'll get there. Fateful arrogance. That's it. I've spent the last few days with this. You will either put your trust in what you have or in who has you. And how you answer that question will determine whether your life is marked by fear, Fateful Arrogance or Faith. If you have a Bible, I want you to turn with me tonight to what is probably the most famous story in the Old Testament, if not the Bible. If you're new to the Bible, I promise you, you're not new to this story. It's the story of David and Goliath. I hope we're going to see this story with new eyes tonight. This story is a massive story when we talk about leadership, and some of you guys want to make sure that we see Jesus in this story. I promise you we will get there. But as we look at this story, we're going to see three different leaders. Often when we look at this story, we just contrast Saul and David. But what I need you to understand is that there are three different leaders in this story that all find themselves in circumstances that are bigger than they are. And the three leaders are Saul, Goliath, and David. We're going to look at each one of them. Two of them, Saul and Goliath, are going to be people who put their trust in what they have. David is going to be a leader who puts his trust in who has him. And so if you have a Bible, look with me. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17 is where we're going to be. And I'm going to tell you, this chapter has 58 verses in it. I'm going to try and read all of them. I don't know if that's going to happen tonight. We'll just see. But we are going to blaze through this tonight. And I'll just tell you this as you're getting there, for all of you kind of theology students who kind of want to go deeper, the commentary that has been most helpful for me as I've sought to understand this story with greater depth, unpacking the details, it is Robert Bergen's commentary. Has been incredibly helpful. So what I want to do is I want to first zero in on Saul and his leadership. Then we're going to zoom out. We're going to move over to Goliath. We're going to zero in on his leadership, and then we will finally move to David. Saul, as I told you, was someone who put his trust in what he had. So here's what we're going to learn from Saul. Don't miss it. Fear was his response. Fear, don't miss this, fear is the result of believing that what you have is not enough. Remember, Saul put his trust in what he had. Fear is the result of believing that what you have is not enough. So look with me, chapter 17. First three verses just give us the setup. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines, and the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them." So you get the picture. Two different armies going to battle. They're in a valley. It's a dry riverbed, and it's a valley that slopes down about a half mile on either side. They take up, they move in together. Their armies are going against each other. Now, that's the setup. Here's the crisis for Saul. Verse 4, it says, "And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath." A champion, that word, it means a man in between the two. So here's the idea of a champion. It is one man who emerges from his army and basically enters into a one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat battle to the death. And the thought is it's known as a representative battle. Instead of both armies going to war and losing a bunch of men, each army would just pick one person, and those two would fight, and whoever won, that person's entire army won, and whoever lost, the entire army loses. And so here is this champion, the man who goes between the two. A champion named Goliath of Gath. And here's what it says. It says his height was 6 cubits in a span. That's about 9 feet, 9 inches. This guy is truly a giant. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's about 126 pounds. So just think, this guy's armor weighed as much as probably some of the men in Israel's army. He had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. That is 15 pounds. So we're talking about just the head. Just the head of his spear weighed 15 pounds, and his shield bearer went before him. So here's a guy who had a guy. So the guy had a guy. And that guy's job was just to carry around that guy's shield. That's your full-time job. I don't know if benefits came with it, but like your job, carry the shield. That's it. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." So I want you to understand this is the longest description of military attire in the entire Old Testament. Why? Why does the author go to this much detail? It's because he's trying to highlight and circle and star the fact that Saul's circumstances are bigger than he is. Like if you were judging by the outward appearance, Goliath appears invincible. And that's a problem because what Goliath just proposed was if the Israelites lose, then they will become slaves to the Philistines. And so talk about responsibility on Saul's shoulders. Saul is responsible for his people, whether or not they're going to become slaves. And now he's looking at a literal giant who appears to be invincible. Now, here's the problem. If you were with us last week, you saw in chapter 16 that God is talking to Samuel. He says, "Hey man, don't look at the outward appearance. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart." And so what we see here is even some theological overflow. It's spilling over from chapter 16 to chapter 17. And what we see Saul doing what God says not to do. Saul looks at the outward appearance. And what does Saul do? He puts his trust in what he has. And he compares what he has to what Goliath has. And what's his response? Look at verse 11. What does it say? His response is, the wind is not helpful tonight. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That's Saul's response, fear. Why? Because he put his trust in what he had. Like if you were here last week, we saw that when the nation of Israel was first introduced to Saul, we found out that Saul was the tallest person in all the land. That's why they loved him, because of his height. But now, one of his greatest strengths means nothing because he's vertically challenged in comparison to Goliath. And Saul has an entire army of men at his disposal, but he doesn't have one man that he can look at and be like, "You're my guy. Go get that guy." He looks at what he has. He looks at what Goliath has. He sees Goliath's height. He sees his armor. He sees his shield guy. And what's his response? His response is fear. Remember what we said. Fear is the result of believing that what you have is not enough. Let me put it in more spiritual terms, so don't miss this. Let's just put it in spiritual terms. Fear is the result of acting like your circumstances are too big and your God is too small. That's what's happening in this moment. Saul is acting like his circumstances are too big and his God is too small. So I just want to get really practical with you guys. What does fear practically look like in leadership? Okay, let me just spell it out for you. This is what it looks like to operate in fear. Some of you guys are like, "I don't need you to spell it out for me. Fear is like my jam. It's kind of my anthem. It's what I do really well. I get stressed out. I get anxious. I don't even know what I'm anxious about. It's just kind of my thing." But this is what fear looks like in leadership. You worry more than you pray. Isn't it interesting? God isn't mentioned once in Saul's section of leadership in this chapter. Like not once does Saul consult God. No, what he does is he worries. You worry more than you pray. And so I wonder if you've ever been in a leadership position where you find yourself laying in bed at night and you're just trying to problem solve. You're trying to troubleshoot. You're trying to figure it out. And you lay there for an hour or 2 hours just trying to make the math work. And then you have the thought, oh, I should probably pray about this. And so then you start praying, God, I just want to pray for this. And then it's like trails off. And then you're back to the equation trying to figure it out. You worry more than you pray. Number 2, you get paralyzed. This is what leadership paralysis, this is where it comes from. Paralysis is the result of problems without possibility. It's problems without possibility. You see, man, I got a problem, and I have no clue how to fix it. There is no possibility for success here. All I see is how I can fail. I see no way out of this thing. There's problems without possibility. You get paralyzed. I mean, you find out in verse 16 that Saul and his men had been there for 40 days. 40 days, living in fear. Next, you act out of desperation instead of dependence. You act out of desperation instead of dependence. Look at what Saul tried to do in verse 25. Look at what it says. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who comes up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So Saul's like, let's just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Here's the deal. I'll give you a lot of money. I'll give you my daughter. You can be her husband, which means you're going to get to hang in the king's house, and then your family can live here tax-free. It's just desperation. It's just trying everything without asking God for anything. He's operating out of desperation instead of dependence. Let me just add a couple more things. You begin to find wisdom in bailing. You begin to think about bailing, and you're like, oh, that actually seems like the wise and mature thing to do. Like if I just jump ship in the middle of the semester, that actually seems like a really godly thing. You begin to talk yourself in to flaking out. And then you medicate. Like you medicate. I'm not talking about medication. I'm talking about you distract yourself. So you eat your feelings, or you get wasted on the weekends just to not feel for a little bit. To not stress out. You go and hook up with someone just to feel something different than stress for a little bit. You zone out and binge something just to avoid the reality. You know what the opposite of fear is? This is so important. You know what the opposite of fear is? It's not confidence, it's fear. The opposite of fear is fear. You're like, that makes zero sense. Here's what I mean. My friend Kylan Perry, he put it best when we were talking about this passage last night. Here's what he said. He said, don't fear your circumstances, fear the one who controls your circumstances. And that's pretty good. Don't fear your circumstances, fear the one who controls your circumstances. See, it's a different type of fear. One fear leads to anxiety, another fear leads to peace. One puts your trust in what you have, and the other puts your trust in who has you. I'll put it a different way in case you didn't like the fear to fear thing. The goal isn't confidence, it's dependence. See, dependence on the Lord will ultimately lead to confidence. Not because God will do exactly what you want him to do, but because he will do exactly what he wants to do. And God's will is always good, pleasing, and perfect. So it's possible that you still might lose your job. It's possible that your organization might still fold up. But you know what? When you live in dependence upon the Lord, you know that you don't have to despair because you're safe in his hands. And the worst thing that could happen is that you die and go to be with him for all of eternity. And that's really not that bad. You're safe in his hands. The size of your God must inform your response to the size of your problem. So that's Saul. Saul taught us that fear is the result of believing that what you have is not enough. Now let's zoom out and let's zoom in on Goliath. He's a different leader in this story. Goliath was also someone who put his trust in what he had. Now, here's what Goliath is going to show us, because Goliath put his trust in what he had, but he didn't have fear like Saul did. Instead, Goliath had fateful arrogance. Fateful arrogance is the result of believing that what you have is more than enough. So Saul believed that what he had was not enough, and it led to fear. Goliath believes that he has more than enough, and it leads to fateful arrogance. Now flip over to verse 41. Let's pick it up with Saul. Not Saul, Goliath, sorry. Struggling tonight. People, come on. Here we go. Verse 41. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer. There's that guy again. With the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. So here's the deal. Goliath comes out and he sees a kid. Like, David is probably about 17, 18, or 19 years old right now. He sees a man-child. And some of y'all are like 18, 19 now. And you're an adult. But you're a kid. But you're an adult. But you're kind of a kid. Anyway, sorry I offended you, but Goliath looks at this guy. And he begins to think about it. He's like, I can't brag about this kill. That's like me beating my 3-year-old in arm wrestling and then showing up to the breakaway office tomorrow and being like, let me tell you how I dominated my kid last night. It's just like, felt so good. No one's going to be like, bro, you the man. Like, that's not a thing. So Goliath looks at David. He's like, this is nothing to brag about. Like, what a waste of my time. Look at me. Look at you. Like, I don't get dragged out for little boys. And so then it goes on. Verse 43, and the Philistine said to David, am I a dog? He's like, what are you going to do? Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? What are you going to do? Spank me like a little dog with your little twigs? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give you your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Goliath insults David's weapons and curses David's gods by his own gods. What is Goliath doing? He's putting his trust in what he has. He looks at David and he looks at himself. He has age. He has experience, he has weaponry, and he has his gods. And he is convinced that everything that he has is far superior to what David has. And what does it lead to? It leads to fateful arrogance. So let me just put it in more spiritual terms for you. Don't miss this. If fear is the result of acting like your circumstances are too big and your God is too small, then fateful arrogance is the result of acting like your circumstances are small, you are big, and God is not needed. And I'm just going to be honest with you. That was me in college. Like, fateful arrogance was my deal in college. And I didn't realize that until I was prepping for this talk. But as I look back on college TA, I can look back and say, you know what, man, I sought to know the Lord and follow the Lord and display the Lord on Anthem's campus, but you know what, my life was marked by an arrogance that I didn't realize at the time. See, it's not that I just thought that I was funny, it's that I thought that I was funnier than most people. It's not that I thought that I was godly, it's that I thought that I was godlier than a lot of people. And I thought that I was more fun at date parties. I thought that I was more likable. I thought that I was better at ministry than most people. I can go around saying this. And you know what? I was able to kind of cloak my life with this very kind of nice guy, good Christian guy type thing. Like, I succeeded in the Christian bubble at Texas A&M. But I believe that I crushed everything that I put my hands on. People put me on stages. They put me in leadership positions. And I looked at myself. I'm already an Enneagram 4, so I already need to feel special. And I made myself feel special. You know what? I look back on my time in college, and not surprisingly, my prayer life was incredibly weak. Do you want to know why? Because I never felt the need to pray. Like I was sufficient. I was fatefully arrogant. And then as I shared with you, though, last week, right after college, I got into a dating relationship, and my character was just super weak. Like it had become stunted. So the relationship was just packed full of insecurity and impurity and drama. And as I shared with you last week, while that was going on, I was interning with a student ministry at a church. And so I was living two lives. Like I was telling these middle and high school students to act one way, and then I was acting another. And so finally the church leadership came to me and they just said, hey, TA, we think you need to step away from leadership for a time. Like you just need to, some things need to get sealed up in your character. And so I stepped away from leadership for 6 months. And you know what the interesting thing was? Great ministry just kept on going without me. And it was so interesting for me because I had found my identity in ministry. I had found my identity in being on a stage and having the spotlight on me and people being like, man, that guy is really good at what he does. And it was amazing for me to step away from it and for those ministries to just continue to thrive. It was as if God was saying, you know what, I love to work through you, but I do not need you if you're not going to truly give your life wholly to me. That's fateful arrogance. Have you ever heard the saying, pride goes before the fall? Of course you have. Like, that's a dumb question. Of course you've heard that. Do you know where it comes from? You know that's the Bible, right? That's not just some, like, cliche somewhere. Like, that's scripture. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. So we need to understand when you think you're strong, that's when you're truly weak. And the reason that is when you're truly weak is because you have shut off the supply of God's power and provision in your life. It's only when you're weak that you open the door to being strong because you become dependent upon God's strength. So we've looked at Saul, we've looked at Goliath, and now let's look at David. We said about Saul and Goliath that they put their trust in what they had. And so one of them experienced fear, and the other experienced fateful arrogance. David put his trust in who had him. David's response was faith. And so don't miss this. Faith is the result of believing that what you have is not nearly as important as who has you. So track with me now, verse 12. Let's just rifle through David. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite. I don't know how to say that. I should have figured that out. Of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him was Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So you know what this tells us? It tells us that David is not old enough yet to fight in Saul's army. You had to be 20 years old to do that. So he's somewhere right around 17, 18, or 19. Jesse said to David, his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also, take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their thousands. See if your brothers are well and bring some token from them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. And so here's what I want you to see. This is the setup. David isn't old enough to fight in Saul's army, but he's already been anointed king. And what do we find David, this little 18-year-old, doing? Well, he submitted to his dad. Like his dad saw David get anointed. He knows David is going to be the next king. And yet his dad is like, you're not king yet. I still got stuff for you to do. So I need you to you're basically the charcuterie board guy. Like you're going to just take it out to your brothers. Give them 10 different cheeses. I can't even name 10 cheeses. But David had them. And they are not gluten intolerant. Like they've got 10 breads. And that's his deal. Like he's the refreshment cart. And he's going out to battle. He's submitted to his dad. And you know what we find in him at 18 years old is he's faithful. Did you see what verse 20 said? I love this. It says, and David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went. Like here's this teenager who's up early doing his job as a shepherd. And the interesting thing was that in Israel, kings were referred to as shepherds. So it's foreshadowing that David will be a good shepherd of people because he was a good shepherd of sheep. So that's the setup. And now we kind of see the crisis. Verse 23, as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So David now experiences the same thing that Saul experienced. He sees the champion come out and propose a representative battle. Verse 24, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And then the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. So David hears this and he's like, whoa. You're telling me the king is going to make you rich, give you his daughter, and let your family live tax-free because this joker comes out and thinks he can do anything to God's army? This is crazy. And I'm going to skip down, but David's brothers hear him talking, and they get angry at him. And it just shows, you know what? When you seek to be a godly, faithful leader, there will always be opposition. It doesn't matter how good you are, there will always be opposition. But you know what? Good leaders are never deterred from what God has called them to do. Skip down to verse 31. With the words that David spoke were heard, they were repeated then before Saul. Isn't that interesting? See, faith is always worth talking about. Like it's always captivating. When you see someone operating in faith, isn't it captivating? Like you talk about someone who's operating in faith because it's not very common for people to have bold faith. I think about listening to my friend's story as they were living in a country that was closed to the gospel. And these friends get kicked out of the country for sharing the gospel. Like they are escorted out. Their lives are on the line. And all the way out of the country, man, their trust, their faith is just in the Lord, and I'm just listening to them weeping. Why? Because faith is captivating. And what do? I run home and I tell my wife. Why? Because it's worth talking about. That's the same thing that's happening here with David. And Saul sent for him. Verse 32, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he's been a man of war from his youth. What does Saul do? Saul starts comparing what David has compared to what Goliath has. And he's like, Goliath's got age and experience. You've got nothing. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard. What a boss. Like, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Now, this is where it feels like David is going wrong, because it feels like he's doing exactly what Goliath and Saul did. It feels like he's putting his trust in what he has. It feels like he's putting his trust in his experience, but he's not. Verse 36, your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Do you see it? David's trust isn't in what he has. His trust is in who has him. Now watch what Saul does. It says, then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. This is so interesting because, again, Saul puts his trust in what he has. And so he's like, you know what, if this kid is going to have a fighting chance, I'm just going to give him all my armor. And as he puts his armor on David, it foreshadows the fact that David will one day be king. Like the king puts his armor on David. And now David is wearing the king's armor, and what does David do? He rejects that armor. It's as if David is saying, I reject the way that you have led, and I'll lead in a different way. And instead of taking the equipment that had been forged by man, what does he do? He takes his stick and he goes and gathers 5 stones, things that were fashioned by God. It's as if to say, you know what, my trust isn't what I have. My trust is in who has me. And then you skip down, and you guys know how this plays out. But verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you came to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of the hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. His trust is in who has him. And you know what you see? You know what you see in this young kid? You see a big view of God and a zeal for the glory of God. Do you hear what I'm saying? David's not out to battle for his name to be made great. He's there that the name of the Lord would permeate the earth. He has a zeal for the glory of God. So you can be a good leader, but you cannot be a godly leader and make your leadership all about you and your name. See, some of you want this stage because you want the fame that would come with this stage. But this stage doesn't belong to me. This stage belongs to God. And so I don't care if you remember my name, but I am here that you may know Jesus Christ as the one who saves. And I tell you, if there's anything I can ask you and beg you to grab a hold of at a young age, it's a big view of God and a zeal for his glory. And you know what happens. David does exactly what he says he will do. And he drops Goliath. And I don't have time to read the rest of it. I'm just going to read you verse 50, what it says. I love this, the wording. It says, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. I find that wording so interesting because who carried a sword? Goliath carried a sword, and Saul carried a sword. Those were the people who put their trust in what they had. But it says that David killed Goliath with a sling and a stone. It's as if to say those who carry a sword put their trust in what they have. Those who carry a sling and a stone put their trust in who has them. So it kind of begs the question, will you walk through life carrying a sword or a sling? Let me just put it in spiritual terms. Here it is. If fear is the result of acting like your circumstances are too big and your God is too small, and if fateful arrogance is the result of acting like your circumstances are small, you are big, and God is not needed, then faith is the result of acting like your circumstances are big, your God is bigger, and your size is irrelevant. That's faith. How does faith rise? How does faith rise in a young leader like you? Cultivate a big view of God and a zeal for his glory. I'll just remind you of one of my favorite verses about leadership in the Bible, 2 Chronicles 16:9. It says, "For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose hearts are completely his." Will you give your heart to him and allow him to use you? Let me just give you 3 things to do from this message. Don't miss them. Before you leave tonight, let me just encourage you to sit with the Lord and to confess any fear or any arrogance in your life in leadership and ask God to exchange them for faith. That's before you leave. Number 2, when you get home tonight, let me just beg you, ask a friend, what is most visible in my life and leadership? Is it fear? Is it fateful arrogance, or is it faith? Just allow yourself to be vulnerable with a friend. And I want to encourage the 2 of you to get on your knees together and pray that faith would rise up in each other. And then this week, I want to encourage you to fight for a big view of God every single day. Fight for a big view of God every single day. What that means is you wake up and you worship God for who he is. You think about his attributes every day. Choose a different attribute. Worship God for it. Let your view of God get bigger and bigger every day. And then I want to encourage you to ask God every day, give me a zeal for your glory. And then I just want to end tonight and just tell you, you know what, if we were to stop here and we were to pray and get out of here, we would have missed the most beautiful aspect of this passage, because ultimately this passage doesn't supremely exist for you and I to be better leaders. This passage in this story exists first and foremost that we may know and enjoy Jesus Christ. Like, I don't know if you realize this. David was a champion, but he was an imperfect champion. Jesus Christ is the greater David. He's the greater champion. You know what? Israel needed a champion, and so do we. Because every single one of us has gone up against the giant of Satan, sin, and death. And in the story, we're really not David. We're a trembling Israel who looks at what we have and we realize we do not have enough. Like, if we have to stand before God and give account for how we've lived our lives, and if we have to stand before God and say, you know what, God, I hope my life was good enough for you. I know that I have a bunch of sin, but I hope that it's good enough for you. You need to understand not one of us will be able to stand before a perfect God with our imperfect lives, but Jesus Christ is our champion. Jesus Christ left heaven and came to earth, and what did he do? He's our champion. He's the man who went in between. He's the one who stepped in and went to war with Satan, sin, and death. It's interesting that David conquered through killing. Jesus conquered by being killed. Jesus Christ gave his life to give us life. And just as David's victory was to be enjoyed and experienced by all of Israel, Jesus' victory on the cross, how he died, was put in a tomb for all of our sin. And then on the 3rd day, when he walked out of that tomb victoriously, his victory through his death, burial, and resurrection is to be enjoyed and experienced by anyone who would come and put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of their sins. But you need to know you're either responding to Jesus with fear, fateful arrogance, or faith. Some of you are responding with fear, like You don't think about eternity that often, but when you do, you wonder if what you have is enough. You put your trust in what you have. If you were to die tonight and you were to stand before God, you'd start listing what you have. You know what, God, I have good church attendance. You know what, I tried to have good morals, and I had good Christian parents. You just need to know it's not enough. Whatever you have, it's not enough. And some of you guys are coming to Jesus with fateful arrogance. You want to define what is right and wrong on your own. You want to decide your own peaceful path to eternity with God. You get to decide whatever you want, that's what goes. And you need to understand that when you come to Jesus like that, when you look at Jesus and you say, you know what, that way is fine for those people, but I'm going to do my own thing. It's the same thing as Goliath standing up and defying the God of Israel. You are defying the God of Scriptures, who has declared, Jesus Christ, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So I want to encourage you to come to Jesus with faith. Faith is not putting your trust in what you have, but in who has you. That Jesus Christ came to rescue you into the family of God so that you can enjoy God for all of eternity. If you don't know him, the invitation to you tonight is to